Hello everyone, my name is Harry and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at the story of Little Hope. A little disclaimer, there will be spoilers in this video, so if you've not yet completed the game or are halfway through it, please turn away now. The story starts with a focus on a bus driver coming out of a diner and boarding his bus. The bus driver reaches a roadblock and gets diverted through the town of Little Hope by the officer. The bus is travelling down the road and we hear the voices of the passengers on the bus. A man is telling a woman about his sobriety, at which point the woman starts complaining about them going the wrong way. The driver, distracted, turns around and tells him to keep it down. At this point he turns back around and the little girl is standing in the road, causing the bus driver to swerve and crash. We then switch to the 1970s, observing the Clark family home in Massachusetts, USA. Now we see that this is a family with its share fare of troubles. The father, James, is a drunk who is on the verge of losing his job. Anne is the wife who is troubled by James's drinking and the state of their family. She doesn't quite seem to understand the seriousness of James's working situation, but she does seem to have a genuine concern about their youngest daughter, Megan, not being quite right.
She's not right. It's serious, James.
You worry too much about that kid. I can't deal with this right now.
Another surprise.
We have Tanya, who is arriving home from work, guessing from the uniform she's wearing, and her boyfriend has given her a lift home. We have Dennis, who is stubborn, kind of a douchebag. We have Anthony, who seems to be the glue holding the family together. People tend to ask him how they should handle certain situations. And lastly, we have Megan. Upon looking around the family home, we do find that Megan does seem to be having some trouble at school, indicated by a report that we find on the table, where her grades are well under par and she is being tardy at school.
I could use a little help.
Maybe if we'd had kids of our own, none of this would be happening.
That's a real low blow.
We get an indication that these kids aren't actually biologically related. It is mentioned through the same argument that Anne couldn't actually have kids of her own, so they're either fostered or adopted. Dennis is mean to Megan and scolds her when she walks over his record collection. John looks at a picture of Megan and says, "Not tonight." Anne shuns her just to get some peace and quiet. This gives us a quick glimpse into how Megan is treated by her family. It seems as if Anthony is the only one who is nice to Megan, whereas everyone else doesn't have time for her or is not very nice to her.
There's no need to be so tough on her. It was an accident.
Everything Megan does is an accident.
Megan decides to take revenge on her family members by locking her mother in the bathroom and locking Tanya outside on the balcony. Setting off a bizarre and sinister chain of events, Megan, seemingly under the influence of a demon, starts a fire in the house, which quickly spreads and the family is completely wiped out. James gets crushed, Anne chokes, Tanya dies one of two ways, you choose, being hung, breaking her neck, or burning alive in the house. Dennis gets impaled, Megan dies in the fire. Whilst looking understandably distressed considering you just watched your own family die in the space of 2 minutes, a stranger then turns up after your whole family has died and assumes, as you're holding matches, that you started the fire, and then Anthony runs back into the house. After this frantic opera of carnage, we transport back to the present day, where we meet the following characters: the bus passengers, Andrew, John, Taylor, Daniel, and Angela. The bus driver, however, isn't here, and he seems to have gone missing. The passengers assume that he's just gone into town to find help. Andrew seems to be suffering from some sort of concussion and doesn't really remember anything. He seems a little confused. So far, we have witnessed two different timelines: the present day and 1970s Massachusetts. We end up at the Black Cat Bar, where we meet a man called Vince. Vince is unhelpful, seems distant, unhappy, and also standoffish. Walking towards the town, Andrew discovers a poppet. FYI, the word poppet is an older spelling of puppet from Middle English, meaning small child or a doll. These dolls were used in folk magic and witchcraft, and were usually used to represent a person, a little bit like a voodoo doll would. We then get grabbed by a small girl called Mary, and are transported to what seems to be a long time in the past. Mary seems to be speaking with an accent from Northern England, and is the spitting image of Megan from the Clark family.
Come play with me.
What witch's trickery is this now, Mary?
I have done nothing.
Hold your tongue.
Reverend Carver's affection for you will be shaken loose when he learns of your infidelity with the devil.
And Mary runs after this woman, apparently called Amy. This era takes place during the witch trials of 1692. Along the way, the characters keep getting pulled from 2020 to 1692 and come face to face with their doubles. The 5 doubles we meet are Abraham, Joseph, Tabitha, Amy, and David. One by one, Angela, Taylor, Daniel, and John's doubles all get executed, seemingly at the behest of a man named Reverend Carver, and due to the testimony of Mary, the child from before. There is something not quite right about Reverend Carver, as he seems to be forcing Mary to keep a secret. Mary even acts up at the trial of Amy, receiving a nod from Carver to fake being possessed in order to frame Amy. The priest seemed to be using his power to manipulate Mary into doing his bidding. The doubles that were executed in 1692 seemingly come back to 2020 in the form of demons and pursue and chase after their likenesses, the demons themselves depicting the gruesome manner in which they were executed. Note that these causes of death match those of the victims of the house fire from 1972 as well, and if the demons kill their mark, so to speak, they suffer a similar fate. Angela suffocates, as did Anne and Amy. Taylor gets her neck broken, as did Tanya and Tabitha. Daniel gets impaled, as did Dennis and David. And John gets crushed, as did James and Joseph. We've now witnessed 3 different realities: the 17th century era, 1970s Massachusetts, and the present day. So the most obvious things connecting these 3 timelines are the striking similarities in the subjects: Abraham, Anthony and Andrew, Joseph, James and John, Tabitha, Tanya and Taylor, Amy, Anne, Angela, and David, Dennis and Daniel. Well, we play through the story, flip-flopping back and forth between these realities, fighting off demons using our wits and whatever weapons we can find. It would be very cool to think that there's something really weird going on in Little Hope, allowing time travel between present day and the witch trials, or that the town is stuck in a loop with the characters being reborn, but no, it's not that. The house fire actually happened. In the Little Hope Cemetery we find a family plot with the graves of James, Anne, Tanya, Dennis and Megan Clark, and someone is visiting Tanya's grave and leaving flowers there all these years later. And the town is abandoned, so who is leaving flowers? At the end of the game, you find out that Anthony from the house fire is actually the bus driver. This is indicated through the fact that the bus driver has a burn on the left side of his face from the fire. There are numerous clues left throughout the game which make sense when you actually look back. Things like the fact that Andrew recognises the police station.
Yeah, there's something kind of familiar about this place.
You got a big-time criminal past?
He recognises the number 1 dad keyring from his dream.
I saw this exact keychain in my dream.
He also keeps the family photo that Daniel found in the factory.
You really want a souvenir? From this night? From this place?
All I know, I'm keeping hold of this.
He goes to the Black Cat bar, and Vince only seems to respond to questions that Andrew asks.
How you doing? Excuse me, but we're looking for our bus driver.
What?
Have you seen him?
Yeah, that's funny.
What's up with the fog outside? It's pretty weird.
Yeah, sure is a thick one tonight.
So thick it's stopping us from leaving.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
Sorry for busting in like this. Bus we were on crashed a little way back up the road there. We're still a little shaken up.
We're still a lot shaken up.
You certainly look shook up.
What happened here? The place seems completely deserted.
Little Hope feels a little like a ghost town. And that fog?
Life moves on, you know. But we don't all go with it.
There a phone in here?
We could use a way of contacting the outside world.
There's a phone, but it's been dead for years.
The moment that bus driver Anthony was informed that he was being completely coincidentally diverted through Little Hope, he starts to emotionally unravel, snaps, and becomes confused due to the unresolved trauma from all those decades ago and the house fire.
We got a problem up
This
ahead.
causes him to have a psychotic break. You can literally hear the exact moment this happens.
We're diverting all traffic through Little Hope.
He then immediately seems confused, which the officer
Okay,
points out.
You seem a little confused.
He drives off, starts hallucinating, and sees what appears to be his little sister Megan standing there in the road, causing him to swerve and crash. He then creates 2 alternate realities in his head to help him come to terms with the death of his entire family. It's clear Anthony had been tragically wandering around Little Hope by himself for hours, hallucinating. Taylor, Angela, Daniel, and Megan do not even exist either in this timeline.
To help us would be greatly appreciated.
There's no goddamn us.
They were just fictional likenesses of his siblings and parents who all perished in the fire. Anthony held some sort of guilt for the fire and struggled to forgive his little sister Megan, as it was clear she started the fire as her doll was found by the stove. But this story is as much about Anthony forgiving himself as it was about Anthony forgiving Megan. The curator says this at the end.
That's the problem with demons. If you don't lay them to rest, they will haunt you forever.
So what's with the witch trials? The witch trials confused a lot of people when the twist came, as this meant that the timeline was actually completely fictional and all in Anthony's imagination. In the beginning of the game, the bus driver has a book about magic. In the house in the 1970s, we see a book on the side which is about witch trials. We see another book nearby named Shroud of Innocence, which also has a description at the top, indicating that it's about the witch trials. Were the books in the house also Anthony's? This may provide us with an explanation as to why Anthony would hallucinate the third reality as the period of the witch trials, as he may have had a fascination with it. Also, Angela does make a comment at one point that she's worried about Andrew's interest in the effigy they find on the side of the road. We also see people without faces. I believe that this has some significance to it, in that everyone in the timelines who did have a face were people that Anthony actually knew or had met. The same can be said for Isaac the Executioner and the police officer, and Judge Wyman and the stranger from the prologue. So, if Andrew is using the faces of people he knows as the residents of Little Hope, then who is the double for Reverend Carver? In the story there are 2 priests. They look identical. In 1692, from what we see through the flashbacks, Carver was manipulating Mary in order to get her to accuse the people of Little Hope of witchcraft and black magic. His motive for this? Well, in the Museum of Witchcraft in Little Hope we find a writ. It seems that the Lamberts and Reverend Carver were in dispute over a plot of land. This was potentially his motive at first, but then he developed a thirst for executing people, and it got out of hand. Something Joseph says backs this up, when he says that Carver had a smugness about him when sentencing people to die. We learn that Carver was studying the occult, despite being a man of God. He was arrested after being exposed during Mary's trial at the end of the game, and lost his position of Reverend. We found his Bible in the museum, which was covered with satanic imagery, and eventually Judge Wyman saw this during the trial. We also find a plaque in the church with all the names of the reverends of the church throughout the years, with Reverend Carver's name scratched out. But this being on here was likely down to the hallucinations, as Reverend Carver really never existed. Then there's Carson. He was the church priest from 1968 to 1973. We never really see Reverend Carson, apart from at the funeral in 1972, but there are plenty of clues as to who he was, scattered around Little Hope. In September 1971, Reverend Carson, after being approached by Anne and James Clark, agreed to help them in disciplining Megan due to her behaviour. This means that Megan would see Carson on a regular basis. The fact that the parents were entrusting their children to him indicated that Carson was a man of high standing in the community at this time. We can gather from a photo in the church that he seemed well presented and popular. We find a drawing in the park, drawn by a child, of a little girl playing with a man dressed in black. It's very likely that this is a drawing of Reverend Carson. It's indicated from another one of her drawings on the wall of the ruined house that Megan feared Reverend Carson. She depicts Carson as a monster with red eyes and long claws, pretty much identical to the demon standing behind Megan in the prologue. Could this demon have been a manifestation of her fear of Reverend Carson? It's possible. What was happening in these meetings we don't know, as these meetings are not documented anywhere. But at one point, she does say to the demon, "You could be right about my family, I think so too." Is this her speaking to her fear of Carson? Was Carson capable of such a thing? Looking at the demon standing behind her, it seems to be wearing long black sleeves, much like a priest would. Again, we can see from the photo in the church that Carson wore all black. Let's dig a bit deeper into Carson. We find various documentation scattered about Little Hope, which is damning in its content as it indicates that public concern around Reverend Carson was growing in the 2 years after the Clark house fire. Carson had a rather dark interest in studying the occult. We find 2 documents, one of them in the bar, where there is a leaflet lying on the side with a seminar on how to spot delinquency in Satanism, held by Carson. Essentially, Carson was trying to hide his secret in plain sight. The second is a sermon in the drawer of the church, in which Carson states that he believes the devil is capable of dividing spirit from soul, and that the soul must be purified through strict isolation and sacrifice. And lastly, we find a newspaper which states that the priest had been arrested for arranging an alleged satanic mass. This is likely why every characterization of Carson in Little Hope is that of evil or of the devil. It's how Anthony's mind pictures Carson. This is backed up by the poster on the side of the factory. Carver was purely just a fictional characterization of Reverend Carson. It is clear that Reverend Carver was grooming Mary in the flashbacks, telling her to keep their secret. The way in which Reverend Carver's behaviour towards Mary is depicted throughout 1692 is basically the mirror image of Reverend Carson's behaviour towards Megan in 1972. So it was obvious pretty early on in the game, at the graveyard, that Vince was Tanya's boyfriend. He's the one leaving flowers. Angela finds a sun pendant under the bench in the graveyard. His car is parked up outside of the ruined house. And we find a locker in the factory with a picture of Vince and a woman, and on the back of the words Vince, and obviously that says Tanya. Case closed. So in summary, here's what I think happened. It's clear that the antagonist of the story here is Carson, as he was the one manipulating Megan, therefore setting all of the events in motion. Angela mentioned at the start that Carson kept Megan back after prayers for 4 weeks running. This may indicate that Megan was being abused and groomed by Reverend Carson. Megan wanted affection from her family, but it seems that they were all too caught up in their own lives to realise what was going on with her. Everything we see in the game, in both present day and 1692 timelines, is a direct interpretation of Anthony's mind. John is depicted like Anthony's father James, always running from his problems and an alcoholic. Angela is depicted like Anthony's mother Anne, afraid of water, even though his mother didn't drown as she was taking a bath when the fire started. Taylor is constantly hinting that she's trying to leave the group, just like Tanya was going to leave with Vince, as shown playing her in the curator's cut. Daniel is depicted as being close to Taylor. It's implied that Dennis is close or was close to Tanya before Vince showed up. The stranger is depicted as Judge Wyman because the stranger accused Anthony of starting the fire and was the reason Anthony was arrested. He personified the stranger as Judge Wyman because in the same way Judge Wyman was making judgments and destroying people's lives in the witch trials, the stranger also destroyed Anthony's life. Anthony was in the jail and scratched "I've lost everything" into the wall. The police officer is depicted as Isaac the executioner because the officer was the one who diverted Anthony down towards Little Hope. He was the catalyst for the psychotic break. As Anthony had a huge interest in the witch trials and everything that happened during this era, he was able to apply everything he had learned about it to make the hallucinations more believable. So let's finish with discussing the fire. We never actually see Megan do the things that she was meant to have done. We didn't see her knock over the ladder to the attic. We didn't see her lock Anne in the bathroom. We didn't see her lock Tanya out on the balcony. We didn't see her knock the doll over. What if she put the doll on the side to get help from her dad? Why was the key in the grandfather clock? Why would Megan put a key back after burning the house down? And why would Anthony be able to go sprinting into a house that is literally a blazing mess, falling down, and only come out with a burnt ear? The fire likely wasn't as bad as depicted in the dream. If you factor in that the police had to be called, they had to arrive onto the scene and the officers went in and saved Anthony, Anthony and the officers surely would have died. We need to remember that the bus crashes and Anthony has a dream about the house fire while knocked out from the crash. This likely isn't 100% how the house fire happened. Anthony obviously took Tanya's word for it that Megan had locked her out, and Anthony was aware that Megan was troubled. Therefore, when he learnt later on that Megan's doll was the cause of the fire, he blamed her. He saw Megan as the reason for the fire. Overall, I liked Little Hope. The twist didn't annoy me because it ended up none of the demons and monsters were real, like some people and some critics are saying. It didn't cheapen the game for me. The Dark Pictures, after all, is a series which explores the dark recesses of the human mind. Why does it have to be about supernatural events and demons and ghosts? For watching, please leave a like and subscribe to support the channel. Take care, and I'll see you again soon.